The most dangerous person in a hospital is rarely the one giving orders. At Mercer Regional Medical Center in Dallas, Texas, everyone knew one name. Daniel Mercer. The hospital CEO. The man whose portrait hung in the main lobby beneath a polished brass plaque. The man whose decisions shaped every department, every budget, every promotion, and every career. When Daniel Mercer walked through the halls, conversations softened. Department heads straightened their posture. Administrators suddenly found reasons to look busy. Some respected him. Some feared him. Most did both. He had built Mercer Regional into one of the most successful private hospitals in the state. The facility stretched across nearly 800,000 square feet, serving thousands of patients every month. Awards covered the walls. Donors competed for invitations to his charity galas. Local news stations called him the king of healthcare in North Texas. Daniel never corrected them. On a bright Monday morning in early September, the hospital lobby buzzed with activity. Visitors checked in at reception. Nurses crossed the polished floors carrying tablets and charts. Physicians moved between elevators with coffee cups in hand. The familiar rhythm of a busy hospital continued uninterrupted. Few people noticed the woman standing near the employee entrance. Claire Whitman adjusted the strap of her small navy blue bag and looked up at the massive building. Her new workplace. Her first day. She stood barely 5 feet 6 inches tall. Her brown hair was neatly tied back. Her uniform looked perfectly pressed despite the long drive she had made before sunrise. Nothing about her appearance demanded attention. In fact, most people passed her without a second glance. Claire seemed comfortable with that. She stepped inside and quietly reported to orientation. During introductions, several new hires exchanged nervous smiles. Others talked excitedly about career opportunities and future promotions. Claire simply listened. She answered questions when asked. She never volunteered more information than necessary. A human resources coordinator eventually handed everyone their temporary badges. When Claire clipped hers onto her uniform, the coordinator glanced at her file. "Transfer nurse?" she asked. Claire nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "Previous hospital?" Claire offered a small smile. "Several places." The coordinator waited for more. None came. By mid-morning, Claire arrived at the emergency department. The ER operated like a city inside a city. Monitors chimed. Phones rang. Staff moved quickly between treatment rooms. The charge nurse, Melissa Grant, greeted her with a quick handshake before immediately returning to 3 different conversations at once. "Stay close today," Melissa said. "Watch how we do things. You'll learn fast." Claire nodded. "Understood." Several nurses welcomed her politely. Others barely acknowledged her presence. A young resident glanced at her badge and whispered to another physician, another new nurse. "Hopefully she lasts longer than the last one." Quiet laughter followed. Claire pretended not to hear. She spent the next hour observing. While others focused on obvious tasks, she seemed to notice everything. Which supply drawers were organized incorrectly. Which monitors had slightly delayed calibration checks. Which treatment rooms consistently ran low on critical equipment. Small details. Easy to miss. Easy to ignore. Around noon, an announcement spread through the hospital. Daniel Mercer would be conducting his monthly executive walkthrough. The atmosphere changed immediately. Administrators appeared from nowhere. Department managers adjusted schedules. Someone even replaced decorative flowers near the nurse's station. When Daniel finally entered the ER surrounded by senior staff, the room seemed to tighten around him. He moved confidently through the department, greeting physicians by name and questioning managers about efficiency reports. Then his eyes landed on Claire. He stopped. "Who's that?" he asked. Melissa answered quickly. "New nurse. First day." Daniel looked Claire up and down for barely 2 seconds before turning away. Make sure she stays out of the way during tomorrow's board visit, he said. We need experienced people visible. Several staff members nodded immediately. One doctor smirked. Another quietly looked away. Claire said nothing. She simply lowered her eyes toward a patient chart she had been reviewing. Daniel continued down the hallway, already focused on more important matters. To him, she was invisible. Just another new nurse. Just another employee. Just another name on payroll. But as Claire calmly watched him disappear around the corner, there was something unusual in her expression. Not anger. Not embarrassment. Not fear. It was the look of someone noticing details that everyone else had missed. And before the week was over, those details would change everything. Tuesday morning arrived with unusual tension hanging over Mercer Regional Medical Center. The hospital board was scheduled to tour the facility the following day, and every department had been instructed to operate at peak efficiency. Administrators reviewed reports. Supervisors checked schedules. Daniel Mercer wanted perfection, and everyone knew it. Claire Whitman arrived before sunrise. The parking lot was still half empty when she walked through the employee entrance carrying a cup of black coffee. While most of the staff would not arrive for another hour, Claire began quietly moving through the emergency department. She checked supply cabinets. She verified medication inventories. She reviewed equipment logs. No one had asked her to do any of it. She simply noticed things. At 7:15 that morning, Melissa Grant approached the nurse's station holding a tablet. We have a VIP admission coming in later today, she announced. Heads immediately turned. VIP patients always changed the atmosphere inside the hospital. Physicians suddenly became more available. Administrators appeared more frequently. Every detail received extra attention. Melissa continued. Male. 62 years old. Local business leader. Arriving for observation after experiencing episodes of dizziness and fatigue. One physician glanced at the preliminary chart and shrugged. Probably dehydration. Maybe stress. Another nodded. Routine case. Claire remained silent while studying the information displayed on a nearby monitor. The symptoms looked simple enough. Yet something bothered her. She reviewed the available data twice. Then a third time. Around noon, the patient arrived. His name was Thomas Bennett, founder of a regional construction company employing thousands across Texas. He walked into the hospital under his own power. He smiled. He joked with staff. His vital signs appeared stable. Most people relaxed immediately. The attending physician ordered standard tests. Blood work. Imaging. Observation. Nothing urgent. Nothing alarming. Claire helped settle the patient into a room and began collecting routine information. As she listened to him speak, she noticed tiny details others seemed to miss. His breathing pattern shifted slightly whenever he changed position. His fingers occasionally tightened against the bedsheet. His skin color appeared normal at first glance, but under the bright examination lights, subtle changes appeared around his jawline. Small things. Easy things to dismiss. Claire finished documenting her observations and approached the attending physician. Dr. Reynolds, she said quietly. He barely looked up from his tablet. What is it? Claire hesitated only briefly. Something feels unusual about Mr. Bennett's presentation. The symptoms do not seem consistent with simple exhaustion. Reynolds offered a polite smile that carried more impatience than interest. Claire, right? First week? Second day. Then trust me. We see this every day. Several nearby staff members chuckled softly. Reynolds returned to his notes. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the correct one. Claire nodded and stepped back. She did not argue. She never seemed interested in winning arguments. Instead, she returned to the patient's room. Hours passed. The emergency department remained busy. Ambulances arrived. Patients were discharged. Shift changes came and went. Yet every time Claire passed Mr. Bennet's room, she checked on him again. Each visit lasted only seconds. A glance at his posture. A quick look at his breathing. A brief conversation. By late afternoon, Daniel Mercer himself appeared outside the room accompanied by 2 board members preparing for the next day's tour. "How is our guest doing?" he asked confidently. Reynolds smiled. "Stable. Nothing concerning." Daniel nodded with satisfaction. Everything appeared under control. But standing quietly near the doorway, Claire looked through the glass toward the patient and felt the same uneasy feeling growing stronger. She could not explain it yet. She only knew one thing. Something was wrong. And very soon, everyone else was going to see it too. The uneasy feeling followed Claire Whitman through the rest of the afternoon. She reviewed Thomas Bennett's chart again during a brief pause between patients. The laboratory results had started returning. Most values appeared normal. A few were slightly outside standard ranges, but not enough to trigger concern among the physicians managing the case. Around 4:30, Claire entered the room carrying a fresh pitcher of water. Thomas smiled when he saw her. "You are the only person in this place who does not look rushed," he joked. Claire smiled politely. "How are you feeling?" "Tired. More tired than I should be." He shifted slightly in bed and paused. Claire immediately noticed it again. The same subtle hesitation. The same brief tightening around his eyes. Not pain exactly. More like discomfort he could not explain. She glanced toward the monitor. His numbers remained acceptable. Yet something about the entire picture felt incomplete. As she adjusted a blanket near the foot of the bed, Thomas casually rubbed the side of his neck. Claire's attention sharpened. "Does that happen often?" she asked. "The neck thing?" Thomas shrugged. "Lately, yes. Comes and goes." "Any unusual pressure?" "Sometimes." Claire nodded slowly. When she left the room, she walked directly to the nurse's station and opened his chart again. She compared his symptoms to the timeline recorded during admission. Dizziness. Fatigue. Intermittent pressure. Breathing changes. Minor fluctuations that seemed unrelated when viewed separately. Together, however, they formed a pattern she had seen before. A pattern that made her stomach tighten. Dr. Reynolds noticed her studying the chart. "Still thinking about Mr. Bennett?" Claire looked up. "Yes." Reynolds laughed softly. "You really do not let things go. Something does not fit." "Claire, every test says he is stable." "Not every sign comes from a test." The physician sighed and folded his arms. "Medicine is evidence. Not intuition." Claire lowered her eyes respectfully. "Of course." Reynolds walked away convinced the conversation was over. For Claire, it was not. 30 minutes later, Daniel Mercer arrived again with several senior administrators. The board visit was less than 24 hours away. Every department was expected to be flawless. Daniel stopped near the nurse's station. "How is our guest?" he asked. Reynolds answered confidently. "Excellent. We may discharge him tomorrow if everything remains stable." Daniel smiled. "Good. That is exactly what I wanted to hear." As the group prepared to leave, Claire spoke. Her voice remained calm and professional. "Sir." Daniel turned, surprised she had interrupted. "Yes?" Claire chose her words carefully. "I think additional evaluation may be appropriate before discharge." The hallway became quiet. Several staff members looked up from their work. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Based on what?" Claire paused. "A collection of observations." One administrator exchanged an amused glance with another. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. "Observations are important, Nurse Whitman. That is why we have physicians to interpret them." A few people smiled. Others quickly looked away. Claire simply nodded. Understood, sir. Daniel turned and continued walking. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds, but it spread through the department within minutes. By evening, some staff members were already joking about the new nurse who thought she knew more than the doctors. Claire ignored all of it. She spent the next several hours caring for patients exactly as she had all day. Quietly. Methodically. Shortly after 7 o'clock, a call light activated inside Thomas Bennett's room. Claire happened to be closest. She entered immediately. Thomas looked pale. Not dramatically. Just enough to catch her attention. Something feels different, he said quietly. Claire stepped closer. The monitor continued its steady rhythm. Yet as she looked into his face, the uneasy feeling that had followed her all day suddenly became certainty. For the first time since arriving at Mercer Regional, Claire Whitman was no longer wondering whether something was wrong. She knew it was. Claire pressed the call button and checked Thomas Bennett's vital signs again. The monitor still displayed numbers that would not immediately alarm most clinicians, but the trend had changed. Tiny shifts. Tiny warnings. The kind that rarely appeared in bold red letters. Thomas looked at her with growing concern. You see it too, do not you? He asked quietly. Claire nodded. I think we need another physician in here. Within minutes, Dr. Reynolds entered the room carrying a tablet. His expression suggested he expected another routine update. What seems to be the issue? He asked. Claire stepped aside and calmly explained what she had observed throughout the day. The changes in breathing. The intermittent pressure. The gradual decline in overall appearance despite reassuring test results. Reynolds listened politely, but his confidence remained unchanged. He reviewed the monitor. He checked the chart. He examined the patient. Then he looked back at Claire. Everything remains within acceptable limits. Thomas shifted uncomfortably. Doctor, I do not feel right. Reynolds offered a reassuring smile. Hospital stays can be stressful. We will continue monitoring you. Claire remained silent for several seconds. Then she spoke carefully. I recommend advanced imaging and a vascular consultation. Reynolds blinked. Based on what evidence? The evidence that something is changing faster than the tests are showing. Reynolds exhaled slowly. Claire, medicine cannot operate on feelings. Before she could answer, another nurse entered the room. The CEO is on the floor again. Reynolds straightened immediately. The board visit was now less than 15 hours away. Daniel Mercer had spent the entire evening inspecting departments and reviewing readiness reports. A few minutes later, Daniel himself appeared outside the room accompanied by 2 executives and a member of the hospital board. Seeing activity inside, he stepped in. Problem? He asked. Reynolds shook his head. Nothing significant. Daniel glanced toward Thomas Bennett. How are you feeling? Thomas forced a smile. I have felt better. Daniel laughed politely. We will have you back on your feet soon. Then Claire spoke. Sir, I do not think he should be discharged tomorrow. Silence settled over the room. One executive lowered his eyes. Another looked surprised that the new nurse had spoken at all. Daniel turned slowly toward her. We discussed this earlier. Claire met his gaze respectfully. Yes, sir. And I believe Dr. Reynolds has evaluated the situation. He has. Then why are we having this conversation again? Claire glanced briefly toward Thomas before answering. Because the patient is telling us something is wrong, and I believe he is right. Daniel's expression hardened. The board member standing beside him folded his arms and watched with interest. For several long seconds nobody spoke. Finally Daniel looked toward Reynolds. Your assessment? Stable patient. Low concern. Observation overnight. Daniel nodded. Decision made. Then proceed accordingly. He turned to leave. The executives followed. The board member took one last curious look at Claire before stepping into the hallway. The room became quiet again. Thomas looked discouraged. Reynolds returned to his paperwork. Claire remained beside the bed. Then something caught her attention. Not on the monitor. Not on the chart. On Thomas himself. A small detail she had overlooked earlier. A detail connected to everything she had observed since noon. Her eyes narrowed slightly. For the first time all day, the scattered pieces began fitting together. And the answer frightened her far more than uncertainty ever had. Claire stepped into the hallway and opened Thomas Bennett's intake paperwork again. This time she ignored the laboratory values and focused on the personal history section. One line immediately stood out. A recent procedure performed at another facility less than 3 weeks earlier. She returned to the room and asked a few quiet questions. Thomas answered carefully. The more he spoke, the more certain Claire became. The symptoms were not random. They were connected. She excused herself and went directly to the nurse's station. Melissa Grant noticed the change in her expression. What is it? Claire pointed to the chart. Has anyone reviewed the follow-up records from this procedure? Melissa scanned the page. I do not think so. Claire immediately requested the outside records. Several minutes passed. Then the documents arrived electronically. Claire read every page. Her concern deepened. The original procedure had been successful, but one recommendation buried in the follow-up notes had never been completed. A specialist consultation. Additional imaging. Further evaluation if specific symptoms appeared. The exact symptoms Thomas was experiencing now. Claire carried the record straight to Dr. Reynolds. He looked irritated at first. Then he began reading. His confidence slowly faded. Where did you find this? He asked. In the outside records. Reynolds continued reading. The room around him seemed to disappear. Nobody mentioned these notes. Claire remained calm. I think they were overlooked during admission. Before Reynolds could respond, a sudden alarm sounded from Thomas's room. Not a dramatic emergency alarm. Just enough to indicate that something had changed. Reynolds and Claire entered together. Thomas looked noticeably worse than he had 30 minutes earlier. He struggled to get comfortable. His face had lost more color. The monitor now showed changes that could no longer be ignored. Reynolds stared at the screen. For the first time all day, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Get a rapid assessment team, he said. The department immediately shifted into motion. Nurses moved quickly. Additional physicians arrived. Melissa began coordinating resources. News traveled fast through the hospital. Within minutes, Daniel Mercer was informed that the VIP patient everyone believed was stable had suddenly become the center of attention. He arrived with several administrators and stopped outside the room. Through the glass he watched staff moving with growing urgency. What happened? He demanded. Reynolds stepped into the hallway. We may have missed something important. Daniel's expression hardened. May have? Reynolds held up the outside records. A critical recommendation was never completed after a recent procedure. Nurse Whitman found it. Daniel looked toward Claire. She stood quietly near the foot of the bed reviewing information on a monitor. She was not speaking loudly. She was not seeking attention. She was simply working. The specialists began arriving one after another. Questions filled the room. Opinions followed. Yet every new piece of information pointed in the same direction. Claire had been right from the beginning. What everyone else believed was routine had been something far more serious. As the discussion intensified, one senior physician entered the room and stopped abruptly when he saw Claire. His eyes narrowed. He looked at her face, then at the way she reviewed the data, then at a faint scar visible near her wrist as her sleeve shifted slightly. Recognition flashed across his expression. The physician took a slow step forward and whispered words that nobody expected to hear. Claire Whitman? I thought you left medicine after Kandahar. The room seemed to pause. Conversation stopped. Even the steady rhythm of activity around Thomas Bennett's bed faded into the background. Claire looked up at the physician who had spoken. His name was Dr. Samuel Porter, a vascular specialist who had arrived only moments earlier. His expression was not one of surprise. It was recognition. Genuine recognition. Daniel Mercer noticed it immediately. You know her? He asked. Porter kept his eyes on Claire. A long time ago. Claire lowered her gaze briefly. Dr. Porter. The specialist shook his head slowly. I have not heard that name in years. Around them, nurses and physicians exchanged confused glances. Melissa Grant looked from one face to another. Even Reynolds appeared stunned. Daniel stepped forward. What exactly is going on here? Porter finally turned toward him. The reason your patient still has a chance right now is because Nurse Whitman recognized a pattern that most people never see. Daniel folded his arms. You still have not answered my question. Porter glanced back at Claire. She remained focused on the patient monitor. Not seeking attention. Not explaining herself. Not defending herself. 15 years ago, Porter said quietly, I worked alongside a trauma response team supporting military medical operations overseas. I was a young physician then. Most of us had excellent training. We thought we were prepared for anything. He paused. Then I met Claire Whitman. Several people stared at her in disbelief. Porter continued. There were situations where equipment failed. Situations where information arrived incomplete. Situations where patients looked stable until they suddenly were not. Claire had a reputation for seeing problems before they became visible to everyone else. Daniel looked unconvinced. And that has something to do with tonight? Everything to do with tonight. Before Daniel could respond, another update arrived from the specialists reviewing Thomas Bennett's records. New imaging had been expedited. Additional analysis confirmed what Claire had suspected. The complication was real. The warning signs had been present for hours. They had simply been hidden beneath findings that looked reassuring on the surface. Reynolds stared at the report in disbelief. How did we miss this? Nobody answered. Claire already had. She had answered all afternoon. Nobody had listened. Thomas shifted slightly in bed. His condition remained concerning, but now the team understood what they were facing. For the first time, they were working from the correct diagnosis. The atmosphere changed instantly. Questions became more focused. Decisions became clearer. Specialists began coordinating next steps. Throughout it all, Claire moved quietly between stations, organizing information, anticipating needs, and guiding communication between departments. She never raised her voice. Yet people found themselves listening whenever she spoke. Daniel watched everything from the corner of the room. Hours earlier he had seen a new nurse who needed to stay out of the way. Now he was watching senior physicians follow her observations without hesitation. Then Porter said something that made the room fall silent again. You know what surprises me most? Nobody answered. Porter looked directly at Daniel Mercer. Not that she found the problem. What surprises me is that nobody here knew who she was before today. Nobody answered immediately. The question lingered in the room long after Dr. Samuel Porter spoke it. Daniel Mercer looked around the emergency department and realized something uncomfortable. The specialist was right. Claire Whitman had spent 2 full days inside his hospital, and almost nobody knew anything about her beyond the word nurse printed on her badge. The irony was impossible to ignore. An institution built around gathering information had completely overlooked one of its own people. Claire seemed uninterested in the conversation unfolding around her. She remained focused on Thomas Bennett. Another set of results appeared on a nearby monitor. She reviewed them carefully and then walked to the attending team. The trend is improving, she said calmly. But we still need to monitor him closely through the night. Every physician in the group nodded. No debate. No hesitation. Daniel noticed the change immediately. 12 hours earlier, her observations had been dismissed. Now senior specialists were following her recommendations without question. Melissa Grant stepped beside Porter. You said you worked with her overseas? Porter nodded. Years ago. What exactly did she do? Porter smiled faintly. Everything that needed to be done. The answer only increased everyone's curiosity. Reynolds crossed his arms. That is not much of an explanation. Porter glanced toward Claire before speaking again. Most people think medical excellence comes from having perfect conditions. The best equipment. The best specialists. The best support. What impressed me about Claire was that she remained effective when none of those things existed. Several staff members listened quietly. Porter continued. There were situations where information arrived incomplete. Situations where decisions had to be made quickly. Situations where small details mattered more than technology. Claire had an unusual ability to recognize patterns before anyone else. Melissa looked toward Claire. Why have you never talked about any of this? Claire finished updating a chart before answering. Because it was a long time ago. That is it? Melissa asked. Claire nodded. That is it. Porter laughed softly. That sounds exactly like her. Meanwhile, Thomas Bennett appeared more comfortable than he had all evening. The correct diagnosis had changed everything. The team finally understood what they were treating. The uncertainty that had dominated the day was beginning to disappear. Daniel stood near the doorway watching the department operate. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about board meetings, donor presentations, expansion projects, or financial reports. He was thinking about leadership. More specifically, he was questioning his own assumptions. He remembered the moment he first saw Claire. The quick judgment. The casual dismissal. The confidence that he already understood her value after only a few seconds. The memory suddenly felt embarrassing. Near midnight, the emergency department finally began to settle. The rush of activity slowed. Conversations became quieter. Yet one question continued circulating among the staff. If Claire Whitman had accomplished all the things Porter suggested, why had she chosen to arrive at Mercer Regional as an ordinary nurse without mentioning any of it? The answer came unexpectedly. Not from Claire. Not from Porter. But from a personnel file that one administrator quietly accessed while updating credentials. Within minutes, a stunned expression appeared on his face. He looked up from the screen and whispered words that quickly spread across the department. This cannot be right. Several people moved closer. The administrator swallowed hard and read the record again. Then he looked directly toward Daniel Mercer. Sir, before she came here, Nurse Whitman helped design emergency response protocols that are still being used in hospitals across the country today. The administrator read the file a third time because he could not believe what he was seeing. Around him, several department managers leaned closer to the screen. One by one, their expressions changed from curiosity to disbelief. Daniel Mercer stepped forward and extended his hand. Let me see it. The administrator passed him the tablet. Daniel scanned the credentials. Then he continued reading. National Emergency Preparedness Committees. Multi-state hospital response systems. Clinical advisory groups. Published research. Training frameworks adopted by major medical networks. The deeper he read, the quieter he became. Finally he lowered the tablet and looked across the emergency department toward Claire Whitman. She was sitting beside Thomas Bennett's room updating notes and speaking calmly with a night nurse. She looked exactly the same as she had that morning. No dramatic introduction. No special title displayed on her badge. No effort to impress anyone. Yet the record in Daniel's hand described someone whose work had influenced hospitals far beyond Texas. Melissa stared at the screen. Why would someone with credentials like this start over as a staff nurse? Porter smiled faintly. Because Claire has never cared much about titles. Nearby, Reynolds shook his head slowly. Most people would put every achievement on the first page of their resume. Porter laughed softly. That is exactly why Claire never did. Across the department, Thomas Bennett's condition continued improving. The treatment plan was working. The uncertainty that had dominated the evening was fading with every passing hour. Several specialists remained available, but the atmosphere had changed from crisis to confidence. Shortly after 1 o'clock in the morning, a senior consultant joined the team through a remote conference call. After reviewing the case, he reached the same conclusion everyone else had finally reached. The overlooked complication had been present from the beginning. The early warning signs had existed for hours. The difference was that one person had recognized them before they became obvious. When the consultation ended, the specialist asked a final question. Who identified the pattern first? Reynolds glanced toward Claire. A nurse. The specialist nodded. Then thank that nurse. Daniel heard every word. For the first time in many years, he felt uncomfortable with how quickly he had judged someone. He remembered dismissing Claire in the hallway. He remembered telling managers to keep experienced staff visible for the board visit. He remembered assuming he understood her value after a brief glance at her badge. Now the evidence sat in his hand, proving how wrong that assumption had been. Around 2 o'clock, Thomas Bennett finally managed a genuine smile. I feel better than I have all day, he told Claire. That is good, she replied. Get some rest. You knew something was wrong before anyone else. Claire adjusted his blanket and checked a monitor. A lot of people helped tonight. Thomas smiled. That was not my question. Claire paused. Then she answered with the same calm simplicity she always used. Sometimes patients tell us more than tests do. We just have to listen. As she stepped back into the hallway, she found Daniel Mercer standing there waiting. For a moment neither of them spoke. The powerful hospital executive who had spent years giving orders suddenly seemed unsure how to begin. And for the first time since Claire arrived at Mercer Regional, Daniel Mercer was not looking at a new nurse. He was looking at someone he had completely underestimated. Daniel Mercer stood silently in the hallway for several seconds before finally speaking. Nurse Whitman. Claire stopped and turned toward him. Sir? For perhaps the first time in many years, Daniel seemed to be searching for the right words. The confident executive who could address board members, investors, and department heads without hesitation suddenly appeared uncertain. I owe you an apology, he said. Claire looked at him calmly. For what? Daniel almost laughed at the simplicity of the question. For not listening. For making assumptions. For deciding who you were before I knew anything about you. Claire considered his words. Then she offered a small smile. You were not the only one. Daniel glanced through the glass toward Thomas Bennett's room. The patient was resting comfortably now. The crisis that had threatened to become something much worse had been avoided because one person noticed details everyone else missed. Still, Daniel said quietly, I should have known better. Before Claire could answer, the first signs of morning activity began appearing throughout the hospital. Staff from the day shift started arriving. The board visit that everyone had spent days preparing for was only hours away. Yet something inside Mercer Regional had already changed. News of the night spread quickly. Nurses told other nurses. Physicians spoke to colleagues. Administrators shared what they had learned. By sunrise, nearly everyone in the building knew the story of the quiet new nurse who had recognized a critical problem before anyone else. At 8 o'clock that morning, Daniel stood before the hospital board and senior leadership team. The scheduled presentation began normally. Financial reports. Operational updates. Expansion plans. Then Daniel surprised everyone. He paused the meeting and requested that one additional person join them. Minutes later, Claire entered the conference room wearing the same simple uniform she had worn the day before. Several board members immediately recognized her name from documents they had reviewed overnight. Daniel addressed the room. Yesterday I believed leadership came from position and authority. He glanced toward Claire. Last night reminded me that leadership begins with responsibility. The room remained completely silent. Daniel continued. Many people in this hospital deserve credit for helping a patient receive the care he needed. But one person demonstrated something we cannot teach with policies or management seminars. She listened. She observed. She acted when others hesitated. Claire looked slightly uncomfortable being the center of attention. Daniel noticed and smiled. Which is probably why she earned this recognition in the first place. Light laughter moved through the room. When the meeting ended, several board members approached Claire personally. Others thanked her for her work. Yet the moment that mattered most happened later that afternoon. Thomas Bennett was sitting upright, recovering well, when Claire stopped by his room. He smiled immediately. I heard they are treating you like a celebrity now. Claire laughed softly. I hope not. Thomas nodded. Good. Because the reason you helped me was not because anyone was watching. Claire adjusted a monitor and prepared to leave. Thomas stopped her with one final question. What made you notice what everyone else missed? Claire thought for a moment before answering. People spend a lot of time trying to be the smartest person in the room. She glanced toward the hallway where nurses, physicians, and support staff continued their work. I always tried to be the person paying attention. Thomas smiled. As Claire walked away, the hospital around her felt different. Not because her title had changed. Not because people finally knew her history. But because hundreds of people had learned the same lesson. Experience matters. Credentials matter. Titles matter. But none of them matter more than the willingness to listen, observe, and care. And long after reports were filed and meetings were forgotten, Mercer Regional remembered the quiet nurse who never asked for authority, yet earned everyone's respect simply by doing what was right.